It was 1952, and somewhere in the forgotten corners of South America, where red dirt roads dissolved into dry hills and the sky stretched so wide it made you feel small just to look at it, there was a village that the rest of the world had simply chosen to leave behind. The people there didn't have much. They had their land, their pride, their quiet suffering, and the kind of faith that comes not from abundance but from having nothing else left to hold on to. In that village lived a boy named Tomas. He was 14 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with hands that were already calloused from years of work that no child should have had to do. He had no mother. She had died when he was 5, taken by a fever that spread fast and was treated slowly, mostly because the only doctor in the region didn't make house calls to people who couldn't pay. He had no father either. His father had walked out of his life when he was 7, leaving nothing behind but a small, stubborn piece of rocky land and a silence that never quite left the house. Tomas had grown up in that silence. He had learned to cook in it, to sleep in it, to talk to himself inside it just to hear a voice. The neighbors were kind in the way that poor people are kind, quietly without making a show of it. A plate of food was left at the door. A nod in the street. A glance that said I see you, even when words didn't come. But kindness, no matter how genuine, doesn't fill every space. And by the time that October arrived, Tomas had run out of almost everything. The last of his corn had been eaten weeks before. The land he had tried so hard to work had given him almost nothing that season. The rains had come late and left early, and the earth had stayed hard and unforgiving no matter how much he broke his back over it. He sat outside his adobe house one evening, watching the sun go down behind the hills, and he made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind of people write about in books. Just the quiet, desperate decision of a boy who understood that staying still meant disappearing completely. He was going to ask for work. And there was only one man in San Isidro de los Llanos who had enough to offer it. Don Aurelio Montesinos owned more land than most people in that region had ever walked across. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had stopped being warm a long time ago. He was not a cruel man in the way that villains are cruel in stories. He was something more common and in some ways more dangerous. He was indifferent. To him, people were useful or they were not, and that was the beginning and end of his judgment. Tomas arrived at the hacienda on a Tuesday morning. He had washed his face in the stream, combed his hair with his fingers, and put on his cleanest shirt. He wanted to look like someone worth hiring. He was made to wait in the sun for nearly an hour before the foreman let him through. When he finally stood before Don Aurelio, the old man didn't even look up from his coffee at first. Tomas spoke anyway. He said he was ready to work. Anything that needed doing. He was stronger than he looked, he didn't complain, and he only asked for a fair wage at the end of the month. Nothing more. Don Aurelio looked at him then. Studied him for a long moment with those flat, calculating eyes. And then he waved his hand and said, simply, start tomorrow. So Tomas started. He worked in a way that surprised even the older laborers who had spent their whole lives doing hard things. He was up before sunrise, loading, digging, mending fences, cleaning stables, splitting wood, carrying water. He took on the jobs nobody else wanted. He didn't complain when the food was thin or when his back ached so badly at night he could barely straighten up. He slept on a wooden cot in the workers' shed and lay awake sometimes in the dark, not from bitterness but from hope. Thinking about what he would do with his wages. Buy seeds. Fix his roof. Maybe, someday, a small animal of his own. Just enough to start. That was all he asked of life. Just enough to start. The weeks passed. His hands hardened. His shoulders filled out. An older worker named Cirillo, who had spent 20 years on that land and had learned to read people the way others read weather, told him one afternoon that he had never seen a boy work like that. Like someone was watching, he said. Like you've got something to prove. Tomas didn't answer, but he thought about it for a long time after. Maybe Cirillo was right. Maybe he worked that way because it was the only moment in his life when he felt like he existed. Like he mattered. Like the world could see him. by the end of the month he was exhausted in every part of himself. But he stood straight when he walked to collect his wages, because he had earned them honestly and completely, and he knew it. He had given Don Aurelio everything he had. Every hour of daylight. Every drop of sweat. He had asked for nothing extra and had complained about nothing at all. What happened next was something Tomas would carry inside him for the rest of his life. Not just the memory of it, but the feeling. That particular kind of cold that spreads through your chest when a person you trusted looks at you and decides, without shame, that you don't deserve what you earned. Don Aurelio didn't offer him money. He waved toward the back of the property and told the foreman to bring it out. And what came around the corner of the stable, led by a rope, was a horse. Or what had once been a horse. The animal was thin in a way that went beyond hunger. Its ribs showed clearly beneath a dull, patchy coat. One of its legs had a long, badly healed scar along the knee. It walked with a slight but unmistakable hesitation, not quite a limp, but a reminder. Its eyes, though, were something different. Even in that ruined body, the eyes were still alive. Still deep and dark and full of something that hadn't broken yet. Don Aurelio told him the horse was worth more than a month's wages. He said it with a straight face and just a trace of amusement in his voice, the way powerful men sometimes speak when they know there's nothing the other person can do about it. The other workers looked away. Cirillo stared at the ground. And Tomas stood there, 14 years old, alone in the world, holding a rope attached to a dying horse, while the man who owed him justice laughed quietly from his chair. He could have walked away. He could have shouted, or cried, or demanded what was right. But something in him did none of those things. He looked at the horse for a long moment. And then he looked back at Don Aurelio with eyes that were calm in a way that made even the old man shift slightly in his seat. He took the rope. He thanked no one. And he walked home. The walk home that evening was the longest Tomas had ever taken, and it wasn't because of the distance. It was because of the weight. Not the horse beside him, though the animal moved slowly and needed to be coaxed gently at every uneven patch of road. The weight was something else. It sat in his chest and pressed against his ribs and made every step feel like a decision he had to remake over and over again. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. The village noticed, the way villages always do. People don't miss much when life is small and slow, and there isn't much else to watch. A woman hanging laundry on a line paused and stared. Two men sitting outside a cantina stopped their conversation and looked. A group of children followed at a distance, whispering and laughing in that careless way that children laugh when something looks fun. Why? And they haven't yet learned how much words can land like stones. Someone called out from a doorway. Said that Don Aurelio had finally lost his mind if he was paying workers in broken horses. Someone else laughed. Another voice said that maybe the boy was the one who had lost his mind, taking it without a fight. Tomas didn't turn around. He kept walking, one hand loosely holding the rope, his eyes on the road ahead, his face showing nothing. When he got home, he led the horse to the small patch of land beside his house and stood there for a while just looking at him in the fading light. Up close, the damage was more visible. The scar on the leg was deep and old, the kind that had healed wrong because no one had cared enough to treat it properly at the time. The horse's breathing was slightly labored. He was underweight by a significant amount. His coat was dry and without luster. But he stood. He stood on his own four legs and looked back at Tomas with those eyes that seemed to contain something unspoken, something patient and enduring and almost unbearably dignified for a creature in that condition. Tomas didn't have much. But he took what little he had and he gave it to the horse first. He found a bucket, filled it with water from the well, and placed it in front of him. He gathered what dry grass and hay he could from the edge of his property and laid it down. He went inside, heated some water, tore a strip of cloth from an old shirt, and came back out in the dark to clean the horse's leg as carefully as he could, working by the light of a small oil lamp, speak the whole time quietly. I'm Not words that meant anything in particular. Just sounds. Just the presence of a voice that wasn't unkind. That night, Tomas ate almost nothing. There wasn't enough for both of them, and he had already decided, without making a big thing of it in his own mind, that the horse came first. He named him Viento. Because even broken and slow and barely holding together, there was something about the way the horse moved that suggested he had once known what it felt like to be fast. To be free. To cut through open air with nothing in front of him. The days that followed were hard in the particular way that caring for something helpless is always hard. It asks everything of you and gives back nothing at first. Nothing visible, anyway. Tomas built a rough shelter out of scrap wood and palm leaves to protect Viento from the sun and the cold nights. He spent hours each day tending to him, cleaning the wound, watching for signs of infection, adjusting the diet as best he could with the little money he managed to earn doing odd jobs around the village. A few coins here, a small bag of grain there. He bartered, he borrowed, he went without. The village kept watching. And the village kept talking. Some people said it with pity. Others said it with contempt. The same men from the cantina shook their heads whenever Tomas passed. What does the orphan boy think he's doing, nursing a dead horse back to life? That animal is finished. Anyone can see it. He's wasting what little he has left on something that will never amount to anything. Some people said it loud enough for him to hear. Others said it just quietly enough that they could pretend they hadn't. Either way, it reached him. It always does. But here is the thing about Tomas that those people didn't understand, that maybe you can only understand if you have lived the kind of life he had lived. When you have been dismissed your whole existence, when the world has looked at you since you were a small child and decided you were worth very little, you develop either one of two things. You develop the kind of bitterness that hollows you out from the inside. Or you develop a stubbornness so deep and so quiet that it becomes almost like faith. Tomas had the second kind. He didn't argue with the village. He didn't defend himself, explain himself, or try to convince anyone. He just kept showing up. Every morning, before the sun was fully up, he was there beside Viento. Every evening, no matter how tired he was there again. And slowly, so slowly that you could almost miss it if you weren't paying close attention, things began to change. It started with the horse's eyes. They had always been alive, but now there was something more in them. An alertness. A recognition. When Tomas approached, Viento would turn his head toward him and hold still in a way that meant something. Not just the stillness of an exhausted animal. The stillness of a creature that has decided to trust. Then the coat began to change. The dryness gave way to a faint shine. The ribs became slightly less visible. Viento began to eat with more appetite, moving toward his food instead of standing passively in front of it. He started to hold his head a little higher. Started to shift his weight with more confidence. The hesitation in his step didn't disappear, but it lessened. And on a morning in late January, about 3 months after Tomas had brought him home, Viento did something that stopped the boy completely in the middle of the yard. He ran. Not far. Not fast. Just a short, spontaneous burst across the small open patch of land beside the house, tail up, neck stretched forward, and for just a few seconds, he looked like something entirely different from the broken Animadon Aurelio had handed over at the end of a rope. He looked like what he had once been. And then he slowed and turned and looked at Tomas, breathing harder, nostrils wide, and Tomas stood there with his hand over his mouth and his eyes full of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt hope. Real hope. Not the fragile kind that breaks the moment you look at it too closely. The kind that has been earned through months of mournings and sacrifice and stubbornness. The kind that feels solid under your feet. It was Cirillo who told him about the race. The old worker came by one afternoon, sitting down on the low stone wall near the house, turning his hat in his hands the way he always did when he had something to say but wasn't sure how to say it. Don Aurelio had announced a horse race. A big one. Set for the following spring. There would be horses from neighboring towns, animals that had been trained, fed, and cared for by professionals. The prize was significant, and the whole region would be watching. Cirillo looked at Viento for a long time. Then he looked at Tomas. He didn't say you should enter. He didn't say you have a chance. He just said, I remember that horse when he was young. Before the accident. I've never seen anything like him on a track. Not before or since. Then he put his hat back on, stood up slowly, and walked away. Tomas stood alone in the yard for a long time after that. The sun was warm on his shoulders. Viento was grazing calmly a few feet away. And something was moving inside the boy's chest that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't ambition exactly. It wasn't anger, though there was some of the tea too. It was more like a question that had been waiting a long time to be asked out loud. What if they're all wrong? What if everything they threw away still has something left in it? He made his decision that evening. And he told no one that the training began the next morning before dawn. Tomas didn't know much about preparing a horse for a race. He had no trainer, no manual, no experienced eye to guide him. What he had was observation, patience, and an instinct that had been quietly developing over months of caring for an animal he had come to know better than he knew most people. He had watched Viento move. He had noticed which leg he favored and when. He had learned the rhythm of his breathing, the way his ears moved when he was comfortable versus when something was bothering him, the specific way he held his body when he was tired versus when he simply didn't want to do something. Tomas had paid attention in the way that only people who have nothing else to distract them truly can. He started gently. Short distances at a slow pace, just getting Viento used to moving with intention rather than wandering. He ran alongside him at first, which made for a strange sight in the early morning light, a thin boy in worn boots jogging beside a horse twice his size across a dry field. But it worked. Viento responded to his presence beside him. He seemed to draw something from it, some reassurance that made him willing to push a little further than he might have on his own. As the weeks passed, Tomas extended the distances. He began riding. He had no saddle, so he rode bareback, which meant he felt every movement of the horse directly, every shift of muscle and weight, every hesitation and surge. It was uncomfortable and sometimes painful, and it was also, in a way he couldn't entirely explain, one of the most honest experiences of his life. There was nothing between them. No padding, no distance, no equipment to compensate for what either of them lacked. Just a boy and a horse learning each other's language. Viento's leg remained a concern. Tomas watched it constantly. On days when it seemed to bother him more, they walked instead of ran. On days when Viento moved with ease and something that looked almost like eagerness, Tomas let him open up a little, let him find his own speed, and what he saw on those mornings took his breath away quietly and completely. The horse was fast. Not fast in the modest, encouraging way you tell someone they're doing well. Fast in the way that made the air move differently. Fast in a way that felt like memory, like a body recalling something it had always known how to do. Word got around, because in small villages word always gets around. People began to notice the boy and the horse training in the fields at the edge of town. At first the reaction was the same as it had always been. Amusement. Dismissal. The kind of laughter that isn't really about humor but about the need to put things back in the box they came from. The orphan boy and his ruined horse. What a pair. What a waste of time. But something shifted after a few weeks, in a small number of people at least. Cirillo came by again and stood at the fence for a long time without saying anything, just watching. When Tomas pulled Viento to a stop nearby, the old man nodded once, slowly, with his arms folded across his chest, and that nod said more than most speeches. A woman from the village who sold vegetables in the market started leaving a small bundle of good hay outside Tomas's gate in the mornings without explanation. A younger boy from the edge of town began showing up to watch the training sessions, sitting on the ground with his knees pulled up, saying nothing, just watching with wide, serious eyes. Not everyone came around. Don Aurelio heard about it, of course. He heard everything that happened in San Isidro de los Llanos. His reaction, when it was reported back to those who were listening, was a short laugh and a dismissive wave. He said the boy was welcome to humiliate himself if that was how he wanted to spend his time. He said it without malice, which was somehow worse than if he had said it with anger. Malice at least acknowledges that you matter enough to be hated. Indifference says something colder. It says you are not even worth the energy of opposition. Tomas heard what Don Aurelio said. He let it settle in him for a moment, the way you hold something hot in your hand just long enough to feel it. And then he went back to training. There was one evening in March, about 6 weeks before the race, that Tomas would remember for the rest of his life. He had been pushing hard that day, maybe too hard, and Viento had stumbled slightly on a turn, not falling, not even close, but enough to make Tomas's heart stop for a full second. He pulled him to a walk immediately, dismounted, ran his hands down the scarred leg with careful, practiced attention. Nothing felt wrong. Viento stood calmly and turned his big head to look at him with that expression that Tomas had come to read as something close to reassurance. Tomas sat down on the ground right there in the middle of the field. The sky was going orange and purple above him. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear exactly but from the sudden release of something he had been holding tightly for a very long time. He put his face in his hands and breathed. And Viento, without being asked, without any prompt at all, stepped carefully forward and lowered his head until his muzzle was resting gently against the top of the boy's bent head. They stayed like that for a while. A broken boy and a broken horse, holding each other up in a field at the edge of a village that didn't expect much from either of them. Tomas lifted his face. Eventually, looked at Viento, and said out loud, to no one but the horse and the fading sky, "We're going to show them. Not to prove something to them, but to prove something to ourselves." The day of the race arrived on a Saturday in late April when the air was still cool in the morning but promised heat by noon. People came from several villages, not just San Isidro. There were vendors selling food and drinks along the road that led to Don Aurelio's property, where the track had been marked out across a wide, flat stretch of land. Flags had been hung between posts. A wooden viewing area had been constructed for the wealthiest spectators. There was music and laughter and the smell of food cooking and the specific electricity that gathers wherever people come together to watch something competitive. The horses that had been entered were impressive in the way that money makes things impressive. They were groomed to a shine, their coats gleaming, their equipment well-fitted and expensive. Their riders wore proper clothes and carried themselves with the ease of people who expected to win because winning was something that happened to people like them. There were 6 entries in total. 5 that belonged to landowners and wealthy men from across the region, and 1 that didn't. When Tomas led Viento through the entrance and onto the grounds, the reaction was not the laughter he might have expected. It was something quieter and in some ways more revealing. It was the silence of people who don't quite know what they're looking at. Because Viento, on that morning, did not look like the dying animal Don Aurelio had handed over on a rope 6 months before. He wasn't gleaming like the others. He didn't have expensive tack or a decorated bridle. But he stood differently now. He held himself with a stillness and a presence that drew the eye in a way that was hard to explain immediately but impossible to ignore. Don Aurelio saw them from the viewing area. Something moved across his face briefly, something unreadable, before it settled back into its usual expression of composed authority. He said nothing. The other riders looked at Tomas with varying degrees of curiosity and condescension. One of them, a young man about 20 years old on a beautiful chestnut horse, leaned over and said something to his companion that made them both smile. Tomas didn't react. He was focused entirely on Viento, running a hand along his neck, speaking quietly, keeping him calm in the noise and the crowd and the strange charged atmosphere of a day that had suddenly become much bigger than either of them. Cirillo appeared at his side just before the start. The old man looked at Viento for a long moment. Then he looked at Tomas. He said only this: "Don't race their horse. Race yours." Tomas nodded. He understood exactly what that meant. They lined up at the start. 6 horses, 6 riders, the whole crowd pressed along the edges of the track. The morning sun was fully up now, warm on every face. Someone raised a flag. The crowd went still in that particular collective way that only happens in the last second before something begins. And then it began. The horses burst forward like a single explosion of sound and motion, and the crowd erupted immediately, voices rising into the warm morning air, names being called out, hands gripping fence posts, bodies leaning forward as if those few extra inches might let them see better what was already happening right in front of them. Tomas did not push. That was the first thing anyone watching closely would have noticed. While the other riders drove their horses hard from the very first stride, urging them forward with heels and voice and the particular desperation of people who confuse speed with strategy, Tomas sat quietly on Viento's back and let the others go. Within the first 100 yards, 4 horses had surged ahead. Then 5. Viento was in last place, running smoothly but without urgency, and the section of crowd that had been watching with cautious curiosity began to murmur and shake their heads and look away. Someone near the fence said it was over before it started. Someone else laughed. A woman covered her eyes. And Don Aurelio, watching from the elevated platform with his arms folded and his expression unreadable, said nothing at all. But Tomas wasn't racing their race. He was racing his own. He could feel Viento beneath him the way you can only feel something when there is nothing between you and it. He felt the horses breathing, steady and deep and controlled. He felt the powerful rhythm of those legs, not strained, not forced, but moving with a kind of deliberate patience that had its own authority. Viento knew something the other horses didn't know yet. He knew how to wait. He had spent 6 months learning, alongside a boy who had spent his entire life doing the same thing. At the halfway point, the lead horse was several lengths ahead and the crowd was already beginning to celebrate. The young man on the chestnut horse was in first, leaning forward, looking confident, looking like someone who had already written the ending of this story in his own mind. Behind him, the other horses were beginning to show the first signs of effort. Their breathing was louder. Their strides were becoming slightly less fluid. The early burst of speed was asking for its payment, the way it always does eventually. And that was when Tomas asked Viento for something more. Not everything. Not yet. Just more. He shifted his weight slightly forward, changed the pressure of his knees, and spoke one quiet word directly into the horse's ear. A word he had used during training on the mornings when Viento had found his real stride, when the field had opened up and something ancient and powerful had woken up inside that scarred body and remembered what it was. The word was simply his name. What happened next was something that people in San Isidro de los Llanos would describe for years afterward, in cantinas and kitchens and on front steps in the evenings, always with the same mixture of wonder and slight disbelief, as if they still hadn't entirely decided whether they had really seen it or whether memory had made it more than it was. But it was real. Every person standing along that fence saw it with their own eyes. Viento ran. Not the careful, measured running of the first half. This was something different. This was a horse remembering himself completely. His stride lengthened in a way that seemed physically improbable given everything that body had been through. His head dropped slightly forward, his neck stretched out, and he moved across that ground with a fluidity and a power that made the other horses look suddenly ordinary by comparison. The scar on his leg meant nothing in that moment. The months of weakness and slow recovery meant nothing. What remained, what had always remained underneath all of it, was the truth of what this animal had always been before the world had decided he was finished. The crowd felt it before they understood it. The laughter stopped. The murmuring stopped. People who had turned away turned back. A silence moved through the crowd that was not the silence of boredom but the silence of witnessing something that demands your full attention because some part of you recognizes, even before your mind catches up, that you are watching something true. Viento passed the 5th horse. Then the 4th. Then the 3rd. Each one fell behind with a kind of inevitability, the way things fall behind when something that was always meant to be ahead of them finally arrives in its proper place. The young man on the chestnut heard him coming before he saw him, heard the change in the crowd's sound, heard the drumming of hooves that was getting louder instead of staying the same, and he turned his head just briefly to look back, and in that moment of looking back he lost something he would never quite recover in this race. Viento came past him like wind. Like his name. Like something that had been held back for too long and had finally been released into the open air where it belonged. He crossed the finish line first. The sound that came from the crowd was not the polished, expected cheer of a result everyone had anticipated. It was rawer than that. It was the sound of surprise colliding with emotion, of people who had expected one story and received another one entirely. Some people cheered. Some people stood completely still with their hands over their mouths. The small boy who had been watching the training sessions from the ground with his knees pulled up was somewhere in that crowd, crying without knowing exactly why, the way children sometimes cry when they feel something too large for their bodies to hold quietly. Cirillo stood at the fence with his arms folded and his head bowed slightly, and if you had looked closely you would have seen that his shoulders were shaking just a little. Tomas brought Viento to a slow stop past the finish line and sat there for a moment without moving. His chest was heaving. His eyes were full. He leaned forward and pressed his face against Viento's neck and stayed there, breathing, feeling the heat of the horse beneath him and the rapid movement of that great heart gradually slowing back toward calm. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his fist. He just held on, the way you hold on to something when you finally understand how close you came to losing it, or never having it at all. Don Aurelio came down from the platform himself. That alone told you something, because Don Aurelio did not come down from platforms to go to people. People came up to him. But he walked across the track with his hands clasped behind his back and stopped a few feet from where Tomas had dismounted and was standing beside Viento with one hand resting on the horse's neck. The old man looked at the horse for a long time. Something had changed in his face. Not broken exactly, but shifted. Like a door that had been locked for a very long time and had just moved slightly on its hinges. He said he hadn't recognized him at first. Said he had forgotten what the horse had looked like in his prime, before the accident, before he had written him off as a lost cause. He said it quietly, and it cost him something to say it, you could see that. Then he reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. The prize money. He held it out to Tomas. Tomas looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Don Aurelio. And he said, with a steadiness in his voice that had not been there 6 months ago, that he had not raced for money. He said he had entered the race because someone needed to show this horse that he was still worth something. And because he himself had needed to know the same thing. He said that what Don Aurelio had done, handing a dying animal to a hungry boy in place of a fair wage, had not been just. And that they both knew it. He said it without anger, without performance, without any desire to humiliate. He said it the way you state a fact that everyone in the room already knows but that has never been said out loud. Don Aurelio stood there for a long moment. The crowd was very quiet. Then the old man did something that no one in San Isidro de los Llanos had ever seen him do. He nodded. A slow, deliberate nod that acknowledged something he could not bring himself to put into full words but that his body was willing to admit even if his voice was not quite ready. He placed the envelope in Tomas's hand anyway and closed the boy's fingers around it. He said that a man who works deserves to be paid, and that he had been wrong. Then he turned and walked back toward the platform, and he walked differently than he had walked away from it, somehow smaller and also, strangely, more human. Tomas stood there with the envelope in his hand and Viento beside him and the whole village watching. He didn't feel victorious in the way he had imagined victory might feel on the nights when he had allowed himself to imagine it at all. He felt something quieter and more permanent than victory. He felt like himself. Fully, completely, undeniably himself. Like a person who had been told his whole life that he was worth very little and had finally, through patience and love and an unwillingness to let go of what others had discarded, proved to himself that the people doing the telling had simply been wrong. He used the prize money carefully. He repaired his house. He bought seeds and planted them properly, with enough water this time, enough attention, enough faith. He kept Viento, not as a racing horse, not as a means to anything, but as what he had always been since that first night when a boy with nothing had given a broken animal the only thing he had left to give. A companion. A mirror. A reminder. The village remembered that day for a long time. Not just because of the race, but because of what it had shown them about themselves, about what they had dismissed, about what they had laughed at, about the stories they had decided were already over before they had reached their ending. Some of them changed quietly because of it. Some of them didn't. That is the way of things. But here is what stayed. Here is the lesson that race carried inside it like a seed inside a dry shell waiting for water. The world will look at you sometimes and decide that you are finished. It will look at your circumstances, your losses, your wounds, the things that have been taken from you or that were never given to you at all, and it will make a judgment. It will hand you something broken and call it enough. It will watch you walk away and laugh at your back. And everything in you will want to believe it, because when enough voices say the same thing for long enough, it starts to sound like truth. But it isn't truth. It is only opinion. And opinions, no matter how loud or how many, cannot reach the place inside you where your actual worth lives. That place doesn't know about your poverty or your scars or your failures or the names people have called you. It only knows what you are capable of when you decide, quietly and completely, to stop performing for the people who doubted you and start showing up for the ones who need you. Even if the only one who needs you is yourself. Even if the only one watching is a horse with a bad leg and a heart that never quite gave out. Sometimes the things the world throws away are not broken. They are just waiting for someone patient enough to remember what they were always meant to be. Tomas remembered. And that made all the difference.